Hello, my name is Dustin Hunt, and I will be doing this presentation on John Dewey. So John Dewey was born October 20th, 1859, and he passed away June 1st, 1952. John Dewey, an intellectual giant in education, philosophy, and psychology, passed away from pneumonia at the age of 92. He derived happiness in life from two primary sources: work and family. He will be remembered for both the years in his life and the life in his years. John Dewey was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educator whose influence on educational philosophy and pedagogy cannot be reduced to banality by repetition. He was born on October 20th, 1859, in a country that was on the precipice of civil war. He graduated from the University of Vermont in 1879, then attended graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, where he stood on the shoulders of an intellectual giant in experimental psychology, G. Stanley Hall. John Dewey was born into an intellectual climate thick with consensus and controversy over Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Dewey's philosophical propositions regarding the overlap and interplay between individuals and their proximal and distal ecologies were reminiscent of Darwin's theory of evolution. In the wake of graduating from Johns Hopkins University in 1884, Dewey accepted his first academic post at the University of Michigan. 10 years later, he joined the faculty at the University of Chicago, then finished up his academic career at Columbia University. In 1899, the American Psychological Association elected Dewey as its president. Dewey made significant contributions to many systems and disciplines of psychology, especially functionalism, behaviorism, pragmatism, educational, behavioristic, and social psychologies. He also wrote prolifically about philosophy as it relates to psychology, particularly empiricism, naturalism, and contextualism. Dewey was given the opportunity to put his philosophical and psychological assertions to the test of experience. In 1894, Dewey opened a laboratory school at the University of Chicago to more fully develop his conception of pragmatism. John Dewey's philosophy cannot be understood independent of his contributions to moral and ethical thought. Several of his works argued that schools constituted a microcosm of the larger society, and that the primary moral concern of schools was to educate in the aims and interests of community welfare. Furthermore, he implicitly advocated for an emphasis on socio-emotional development, evidenced by instruction focusing on the, quote, widening and deepening of the child's imagination of social relations, ideals, and means, end quote. Similarly, Dewey also influenced thought on the role schools played as agents in moral and character development, particularly to, quote, methods that appeal to sympathy and cooperation instead of to absorption, exclusiveness, and competition. His efforts to position children at the center of the classroom curriculum has sometimes been misrepresented and oversimplified to mean that the child dictates what and how the material is presented and how knowledge acquisition is assessed. To Dewey's credit, he championed learning that emphasized discovery as opposed to passive acquisition. He passionately promoted exploration and open-mindedness as a vehicle to retain the innate capacities of creativity and curiosity. Dewey made substantial contributions to a variety of disciplines with his work on the intersection of education and democracy. Dewey was convinced that education must be oriented toward the maintenance and perpetuation of democracy so much that he immortally penned these words, quote, "The democratic ideal of education is a farcical yet tragic delusion, except as the ideal more and more dominates our public system of education." Dewey, in collaboration with William James, brought to prominence a movement known as pragmatism. By no means is Dewey the original author of pragmatism, however, but he was highly influential in bringing it to the forefront of psychology and of philosophy and psychology in America. Dewey argued that pragmatism stresses the practical consequence. Dewey argued that pragmatism stresses that practical consequences are the measure by which we should value the subjective truth or meaning of something. Similarly, pragmatism viewed knowledge as the consequence of environmental adaptation, which served as an important pillar in his approach to pedagogy. Arguably the most influential legacy Dewey left us is his impact on education, especially the progressive education movement he galvanized and guided. The progressive education movement conceived of by Dewey was born out of his philosophical leanings and incubated in his lab school at the University of Chicago. The primary thrust of this movement was to challenge traditional approaches to education, namely top-down instruction, the teacher as intellectual authority, and an emphasis on knowledge transmission as opposed to knowledge discovery. As a replacement, Dewey argued for experiential learning, where the learner was actively constructing knowledge through the vehicle of subjective experience. Additionally, Dewey advocated for learning that was conducive to and preparatory for democratic engagement. In conclusion, John Dewey will be remembered for his multidisciplinary contributions manifested in a potpourri of publications representing a prodigious appetite for intellectual advancement and democratic process. Thank you.